Australia's military history is more than a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who answered the call of their country of birth or adoption, and the enduring legacy they created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. Welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, a Doc Network podcast. There are a few events in Australia's military history that have captured the imagination of the internet age to the point where it's hard to determine what is fact and what is fiction. They are usually the first comment you'll see on anything remotely related to Australia's experience in war. I've already covered one of these events earlier this season when I covered the involvement of 3 personnel from the 6th Heavy Battery Permanent Military Force back in 1932 in an event now lampooned as the Great Emu War in Part 2 of the Life, Service and Legacy of Brigadier General Gwynedd Purvis Wyn Aubrey Meredith. Another of these events took place on the 14th of July, 1918, near the French village of Villers-Bretonnaeux, and has captured the imagination of gamers the world over. But unless you've actually stood before the results of this action, you probably wouldn't even believe that it actually happened. This event is one of those where the truth is a lot more complex than the stories that pop up in comment sections. I'm of course referring to the 26th Australian Infantry Battalion's capture of the A7V 506 Mephisto. Now, unless you're from Queensland, or like myself, stood before the behemoth that is Mephisto when it was on temporary display at the Australian War Memorial during the centenary of the First World War, you'll probably have no idea what the A7V 506 Mephisto is, or its connection to Australia's military history, unless of course you've seen the memes about it. And if you haven't, and you follow me on any social media platform, you'll know that I've devoted a lot of time to disproving the rather interesting interpretations. The story goes, via comment sections and TikTok videos, is that during the First World War, Australian troops, drunk and bored in the trenches, see Mephisto sitting idly in no man's land, and get the idea due to the inebriation to run into said no man's land and take off with the tank. Now, while this is an entertaining account of a bunch of drunk Aussies dallying forth to steal a tank out from under the unwitting hapless noses of their German opponents, and does lend itself to the modern interpretation of what an Australian is, fully embracing our convict roots, the truth is a lot more detailed, and you're about to see a lot less larcenous. So, just what is Mephisto? The A7V 506 Mephisto was a German heavy tank built during the First World War in response to the sudden arrival of British landships during the Battle of the Somme in 1916 by the Allgemeines Kriegsdepartement Albertung 7 Verkehrswesen. I'm sorry if I butchered that. But that translates to the German War Department Section 7, Transportation, where A7V gets its name. The vehicle itself is known as the Sturmpanzerwagen, which roughly translates to an armoured assault vehicle. Unlike British and French tanks, who had comparatively small crews of no more than 8, the A7V had a minimum crew complement of 18 and could carry up to 25 soldiers, which lent itself to another feature that A7Vs had over Allied tanks, and there were very few of these. That was the ability to transport assault troops into enemy lines in a manner more akin to a modern-day infantry fighting vehicle than a main battle tank. The A7V series weighed around 30 tons and had a top speed of 9 to 10 km per hour on good roads, which was reduced to a paltry 4 km per hour on broken ground, which most of the First World War was. The armour plating on the A7V had various thicknesses, with 30mm on the front, 20mm on the side, and 15mm on the cupola. In terms of armaments, the A7V was armed with 6 7.92mm MG08 machine guns and a single 5.7cm Maxim Nordenfeldt cannon mounted at the front. Some of these cannons were of British manufacture and had been captured in Belgium early in the war. Later machines used guns captured in Russia. Due to limitations in supplies and resistance from German High Command, which didn't see much tactical use in the invention over more proven concepts such as submarines, gave it a very low priority, which meant that only 20 of the 100 planned machines would actually end up being built by the end of the war, and they would only start to be delivered to dedicated assault units in December 1917 to the start of 1918. To offset this, Germany also had a habit of retrieving disabled and abandoned British and French tanks, of which there was far more numerous of them, for the intent to study and impress them into service. This resulted in a total of 170 Butpanzers, or captured tanks, in German service, and apparently over 35 of them were still ready for battle at the war's end, which vastly outnumbered the surviving number of German domestic British tanks. A7V 506 Mephisto was one of the first heavy tanks built during the war, and would participate in the first German tank attack at Churges, northeast of St. Quentin, where it was damaged. Ironically, there were more captured British tanks in German service fielded than the German tanks themselves. After minor repairs and a fresh coat of paint, 506 was returned to the Abteilungen, or Armour Detachment, and it was at this time where it actually gained the name Mephisto, named after the Faustian demon of German folklore, Mephistopheles. The name was painted on the front and rear armor plates, with a red demon painted on the front, running off with a British tank under its arm. Mephisto's return to the unit was just in time for Operation Michael, the code name for the German Spring Offensive, when it joined 14 other A7Vs allocated to a planned attack on the town of Villers-Bretonnaeux, hoping to capture it and the hill to the north so that the German artillery could dominate the strategically important road and rail junction of Amiens, some 20 kilometers to the west, which was the principal objective of Operation Michael. This was, and I point out, the only time where a bulk of the German A7Vs were fielded in one battle. On the night of the 21st of April, 1918, 14 of the 15 A7Vs allocated, one of them broke down, they were loaded onto trains and taken by rail to Goulicourt, unloaded and hidden a short distance away near the village of Wyncote-l'Écopie, and apologize for that one, about 4 kilometers from the German trenches. A second A7V then broke down, which left 13 available for the attack. At 3:49 a.m. on the 24th of April, they moved to the village of Marcelcave for refueling. A 6-man infantry patrol was allocated to each tank to act as reconnaissance and support, and the entire force then took up its starting position close behind the line in preparation for the attack at 6 a.m. The German tank force was divided into 3 groups, each with a set of objectives. Mephisto was part of the middle group and advanced with the railway line to its right towards its objective, the Bois d'Aquinez, west of Villers-Bretonnaeux, as part of the planned encirclement. The first contact with Allied troops came as Mephisto's group approached the settlement known as Monument Orchard, called Monument Wood by the Allies, or the French name Ferme de la Courtière. The group advanced through an orchard in front of the farmhouse, forcing the entrenched British troops to withdraw, and at this point, though, Mephisto suffered a fuel blockage and had to stop. While the other tanks continued towards their objective, Lieutenant Heinz Thenissen, Mephisto's commander, and some of his crew advanced on foot to help with the attack on the farmhouse, and returned when Mephisto had been repaired. By this point now, they were somewhere behind the other tanks, so Thenissen set off in pursuit. However, soon afterwards, a shell landed immediately in front of the tank, creating a large crater. The tank pitched into it and became stuck. Because of the design of the A7V being a tall box on caterpillar tracks instead of the more identifiable rhomboid shape of British tanks, meant that it lacked the ability to self-extricate itself due to its high center of gravity. The crew had no option but to strip the tank of much of its secondary weaponry and essential items, and abandon the vehicle to continue the attack on foot with the hope of recovering it after the battle. This ended Mephisto's involvement in what would become the Second Battle of Villers-Bretonnaeux, and while the town would fall to German forces on the 24th of April, it would be retaken by forces from the 13th and 15th Australian Infantry Brigades on the 25th of April, 1918, Anzac Day. This battle is also historic in that it's the first in which tanks from opposing sides engaged each other, with 3 British tanks from the No. 1 Section A Company 1st Battalion Tank Corps engaging the German tank Nixie of Abertalang 3 of the Imperial German Tank Force. Despite all 3 British tanks taking damage, the first engagement of tank-on-tank combat was a British victory, with Nixie and 2 additional A7Vs forced to flee. In total, 2 German tanks would be declared lost in the engagement: Alfred, who slid into a quarry and fell on his slide, and Mephisto. Nixie would also be scuttled upon her return to German positions. As Australian and British forces consolidated their losses and pressed the attack, German forces withdrew to the southeast in an attempt to avoid encirclement, and by the 26th, the lines had for the most part reverted to how they had been before the attack started, though the orchard at Monument Wood remained in German hands, with Mephisto, unbeknownst to the Allies, still immobilized but intact in the crater. German engineers did attempt to recover Mephisto during this time, but had to abandon it as the fighting grew closer. By the end of April, the German offensive had switched focus to the south and the French sector of the front, and as the front lines after the Spring Offensive lacked any of the continuous fortifications that form the image that most would conjure up when they think about the First World War, Australian forces discovered quite quickly that they were able to exploit this by conducting peaceful penetration operations into German lines. What is essentially a cross between a patrol and a trench raid, peaceful penetration operations was created with the express purpose of raiding German lines, but then to hold on to enemy outposts within no man's land from which the Australian forces could advance their line forward. While true offensive operations had to get approval from brigade, division, and even army-level commanders to divvy up resources, it was an expectation that a battalion would conduct regular patrols of no man's land and conduct raids on German positions for the purpose of gathering intelligence and prisoners. Another thing that battalions were allowed to do was to consolidate their holdings by either extending or shortening their lines to make their management easier. For example, to withdraw from a position that jutted out from the rest of the line, which was potentially at risk of being attacked on 3 sides, or in a case of peaceful penetration, push the line up to that exposed point, which was exploited quite a lot. So successful were these operations that on more than one occasion towards the start of the Allied counteroffensive in 1918, Australian forces would be tasked with taking objectives in support of a larger operation, only to find that position had already been taken well beforehand. So how did this affect Mephisto? When Mephisto drove into the shell crater and became stuck near Monument Wood, it would initially fall comfortably behind the German lines. But as the Australian units would regularly conduct these peaceful penetrations, some battalions, even making a game of how many outposts they could take during a set period, meant that what was once safely behind the lines became closer and closer to the front until the 9th of July, 1918, 5 days following the successful joint Australian-American attack on La Hamel, which I covered with War Stories host Preston Stewart back in Season 1. Members of the 28th Australian Infantry Battalion participated in a peaceful penetration within Monument Wood and stumbled upon the half-buried remains of Mephisto and a German trench built around it. According to the accounts made after the war, the 28th actually managed to get close enough to Mephisto to be able to assess the capabilities of the surrounding trenches before they were repulsed by a German counterattack that night. 4 days later, on the 13th, the 28th Australian Infantry Battalion was rotated out of the line and replaced by the 26th Australian Infantry Battalion, freshly rested from reserve positions and sent in to continue the advance. After receiving their daily rum ration, which only equated to roughly 35 mils per day per soldier when in the trenches and twice a week when off the line, while I have found sources that suggested the amount given was closer to 70 mils, even at that amount, and the alcohol proof of the standard rum ration being considerably high, with sources suggesting between 95 and 160 proof, which was rarely served neat, more often served diluted, poured into heavily sweetened coffee, tea, or cocoa. It was enough to stiffen the nerves, but not enough to make you legally drunk. In fact, the practice would continue well through the Second World War, and wouldn't actually be abolished on the 31st July 1970. Stiffened by the Tot, as it was called, they would continue to conduct the peaceful penetrations to secure the remainder of Monument Wood, and in preparation for the first major Allied offensive in August 8. Within hours of entering the line, they completed the 28th's objective of securing Monument Wood, and in doing so captured Mephisto within it. It was inferred by some accounts of the operation that German forces were using the hulk of Mephisto as an impromptu bunker or observation post, and that Australian forces had to fight hand-to-hand to clear the Germans out of it. The unit diary of the 26th Australian Infantry Battalion for July 1918 devoted 4 pages to the action of securing Monument Wood and the establishment of new positions and the general disposition of the men. And in those 4 pages, 3 lines are as follow, quote, "During the attack, the battalion captured the derelict tank number 506 Mephisto. That was the first German tank to be captured by the British Army. Otherwise, all quiet on the front," unquote. That front was now half a kilometre forward than what it was at midnight when the 26th entered the line. While Mephisto was the first tank captured by British forces, it was 2 months behind the first A7V captured by Allied forces, as Alfred, the A7V that fell into the shallow quarry near Villers-Bretonnaeux, had been recovered by French troops in May. To address the part of the internet legend that states that Mephisto was stolen, you have to look at what the military's legal definition of what stealing is. Stealing refers to the intentional taking of personal properties like watches, family photos, and wallets, as well as anything belonging to civilians without any military value. As for military hardware, I refer directly to the Australian Law of Armed Conflict Manual, which states, and I quote, "All enemy military equipment captured or found on a battlefield is known as booty and becomes the property of the capturing state. Booty includes all articles captured with prisoners of war and not included under the term personal effects," which is the stuff you charge for stealing for. Despite the fact that Mephisto had been captured by the 26th, it was currently sitting in a shell crater approximately 18 metres within the Allied lines, which meant that something had to be done with it. So, the 26th Australian Infantry Battalion's commander, Major James A. Rox Robinson, decided that it had to be taken as a trophy. This was in line with a request made by the Australian official correspondent and historian Charles Bean to the Australian Imperial Force to collect items of significance to the Australian experience of war, for the inclusion of what would become the Australian War Memorial. For some within the AIF, they took that as, take everything not bolted down, then for things that are, unbolt them and take the bolts as well. And if you're looking for an example of this, I refer you to the souvenir king of the AIF, John Barney Hines, who was episode 2 of season 1. Robinson sought approval from Brigadier General Evan Alexander Wisdom, commander of the 7th Australian Infantry Brigade, to which the 26th belonged. The reason he gave to General Wisdom was that the hull could be used to give shelter to advancing German soldiers, and there was the simple fact that if the Australians didn't capture Mephisto, then the British were definitely going to. General Wisdom agreed and organised for representatives from the 1st Gun Carrier Company, part of the British 5th Tank Brigade, to visit the site to assess if it was even feasible to recover the A7V in the first place, as it was determined early on that manpower alone was not going to be sufficient. On the 15th of July, the 26th Battalion's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Harold Ford Pearson, led 3 officers from the 1st GCC in reconnaissance of the site, and after determining that aside from some damage the machine had sustained to its roof and ammunition store, Mephisto was structurally intact, meant that it could be extricated if the shell craters around it were filled in. While Monument Wood was more or less intact when Mephisto drove into the shell crater to strand itself, in the 3 months since that day, the battlefield had become churned up by repeated artillery strikes. It is interesting to note, however, that Lieutenant Pearson was also responsible for the unit diary for the 26th, and yet there's not a single further mention of Mephisto or its capture within its pages. This was, of course, still going to be a difficult operation to recover Mephisto, even though the 26th conducted a successful attack on surrounding German trenches, pushing their outposts further forward. The tank was still between the Australian front line and its support trenches in full view of German positions. Any mechanical intervention to recover the 30-ton beast would have welcomed immediate and indiscriminate artillery fire from accurate German guns that would have no doubt already sighted the landmark as a potential target. On the 19th of July, the 23rd Australian Infantry Battalion relieved the 26th in the front line, which allowed fatigue parties from the now relieved battalion to work on the nights of the 20th and 21st to complete the arduous task of preparing the site around Mephisto, filling in the surrounding shell craters and clearing debris leading up to the site. According to interviews done after the war, when the fatigue parties were informed of this difficult task, they enthusiastically jumped at it. With the preparation works complete, on the night of the 22nd of July, Lieutenant A.J. Mutton, reconnaissance officer of the gun carrier company, selected the route the extrication would take soon after dark. To assist this, the 23rd Battalion pushed outposts even further. And as armoured vehicles are anything but quiet, arrangements had also been made to mask the noise of the operation, and because of the exposed nature, contingencies had also been planned that if the Germans became aware of what was going on, flares would immediately illuminate the scene and a deadly retaliatory fire would quickly be brought to bear. To overcome all this, it was arranged that during the period that the gun carriers would be working, aeroplanes would circle overhead at low altitudes, which was unlikely to arouse German suspicions because both sides were frequently carrying out night bombing attacks. This was supplemented by nearby artillery batteries targeting German positions, firing intermittently to shield the noise of the gun carriers and also keep the German heads down. As so it happens in war, these measures were largely redundant, as German forces opposite them had chosen the same night of the salvage operation to drench the Villers-Bretonnaeux area with gas. Despite this unpleasant surprise, 23 men of the gun carrier company and 12 infantrymen under the command of Sergeant Frank Hansen from the 26th Battalion accompanied the 2 gun carriers. In the First World War, British gun carriers were essentially an open flat platform sandwiched between 2 large tank tracks onto which an artillery piece, usually a 60-pounder gun or a 6-inch howitzer, could be winched up a ramp on the front. Behind this platform was an armoured box which contained the crew compartment and engine. If not carrying a gun, each gun carrier could carry approximately 7 tons of supplies, which equated to the same amount that could be carried by approximately 1,745 men in a single trip. The force moved through the darkness towards Mephisto. The stricken tank was soon reached, and the men toiled away despite the noxious gas and discomfort of wearing gas masks. Thick cables were threaded through Mephisto's hull and back to the gun carriers, and the idle tank's tracks were carefully oiled before Mephisto was dragged slowly through the orchard. The whole operation was completed by dawn, and Mephisto was safely 4 kilometres behind the Allied lines, camouflaged against the woods west of Villers-Bretonnaeux at Bois d'Abbey. The recovery party went the extra effort to obscure the trail and laid a false one to mislead German aircraft observers. However, due to the effects of the persistent gas and German fire, the 36 soldiers who participated in the extrication were not present at this location. Despite wearing gas masks, they all had become affected, suffering from burning lungs and inflamed eyes. All in all, approximately 600 personnel from the nearby 6th Brigade, which had been watching the line, had been incapacitated due to the gas shelling. They would all be assessed initially by the 6th Australian Field Ambulance before being transferred to the 47th Casualty Clearing Station. This was aside from the 2 men from the contingent who had sustained gunshot wounds, who were then transferred to the 5th Casualty Clearing Station. Some suffered fairly mild symptoms and were soon reunited with their compatriots, but several were invalided to hospitals in Britain for lengthy treatment. The men of the 26th Battalion who were involved in the recovery of Mephisto, along with Sergeant Frank Roy Henson, were Privates John Batley, Geoffrey Bradley, Thomas Clark, Herbert James Dray, Ernest John Frost, Albert William Haight, John Joseph Kennedy, Thomas William Kingston, Richard James Lewis, Arthur George Masters, William San, and George Henry White. Masters and Sam would be wounded in the operation, and all bar Private Dray would survive the war, with the last dying in 1963. Mephisto was taken back to the 5th Tank Brigade's demonstration ground at Vaux in Armignois. near Amiens on the 26th of July. There it drew the attention of high-ranking Allied officers and had numerous photos taken of it. In response to the image painted on the front of Mephisto, with the Palestinian demon running off with a British tank, members of the 26th Battalion set to work to set the record straight. On the left-hand side of the tank, along its long edge, a regal-looking British lion sat with the A7V under its right paw. To make it clear, those who viewed Mephisto just who had captured it, on their side opposite the British lion, the purple over light blue colour patch of the 26th Battalion and the badge of the 1st Gun Carrier Company, along with an Australian Imperial Force Rising Sun badge, were prominently painted. The wording was deliberate and clear. Captured by the 26th Battalion, Australian Imperial Force, and salved, short for salvaged, by the No. 1 Gun Carrier Company, 5th Battalion tanks. These artworks would be soon joined by the names of other British and Australian soldiers who painted their names onto the hull. One enterprising blacksmith also took a hammer and chisels to the hull, recording the names and initials on the armour plating as well. Much like what happened with the downing of the Red Baron's plane, pieces of Mephisto not properly secured started to become the property of souvenir hunters, with components found lying around the tank including a radiator, a fuel tank, part of the driver's platform and controls, as well as machine gun mountings, which became easy prey for opportunistic soldiers. Despite the souveniring, Mephisto was still largely intact, save for the damage sustained in the field. By early October, the tank had been transported to Palainville to a railway siding, for it was transported by rail to the Tank Corps Gunnery School at Merlemont before being shipped to England by way of Dunkirk. While this was happening, strenuous efforts were underway to secure the tank for display in Queensland, from where the men of the 26th Battalion were hailed from. Within days of the recovery, the Premier of Queensland, the Honourable Thomas Joseph Ryan, had cabled the state's Agent General, Sir Thomas Robinson, in London about securing Mephisto. This was joined by a formal request on the 2nd of August by General Wisdom to Imperial authorities to present the tank to Queensland as a war trophy. Agents General were a component of the British Empire where colonies and the later dominions appointed a representative to promote their commercial, legal and diplomatic interests in Britain. And as Australia was a commonwealth of 6 colonies, it meant that even in 1918, each state had its own representative, for a role that's been largely discontinued and absorbed into the duties of a High Commissioner. Sir Robinson was urged to do his best to secure the trophy, while the Queensland newspapers supported the government's actions. Ryan also wrote to the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable William Morris Billy Hughes, as the Commonwealth Government had a key responsibility in allocating Australian war trophies. Despite physically recovering Mephisto, that didn't necessarily guarantee that Australia was entitled to it. In late 1916, the British War Office formed the War Office Trophies Committee to formally adjudicate the dispersal of the trophies captured during the conflict. Initially, the War Office had decided that all trophies captured by the British and her dominions would remain the property of what would become the Imperial War Museum, and all remaining trophies would be then distributed to the Dominion countries. Essentially, Britain would take the best of the trophies and give everything else to the Dominions. However, the Australian government, along with those Dominion countries, resisted this idea, insisting that trophies claimed by their troops should be made available to them regardless of how significant they were. To remedy this, war material of all kinds that had been claimed had to be accompanied by a reason explaining why it was significant to those who captured it. For the most part, captured equipment was generally passed on to the Australian War Records Section, the unit responsible for cataloguing, transporting and displaying of all the war relics bound for Australia, with only a few formal requests to inspect the object first. Larger pieces, such as Mephisto and the Amiens railway gun, were given to Australia on the pretense that we had to get them back to Australia ourselves, and Britain was banking on the fact that we couldn't, as we were also trying to get the 300,000 strong Australian Imperial Force back to Australia. From what I've been able to determine, the British initially made a claim for Mephisto, but didn't put much of a fight for it, as at the time they'd already had the fellow A7Vs Hagen and Schnuck, which had been captured by New Zealand forces. In response, Mephisto was awarded to Australia as a war trophy. On the 2nd of April 1919, Mephisto was loaded onto the transport SS Armagh at Tilbury and set sail for Australia, though agreement on where her eventual destination was hadn't yet been decided. According to the now promoted Lieutenant Colonel Robinson, firstly the Imperial authorities claimed it, then the Melbourne people wanted it for their city. Finally, largely owing to the strenuous and unceasing efforts of the Queensland Agent General Sir Thomas Robinson and General Evan Wisdom, it was decided to deliver Mephisto to Brisbane." Unquote. What Robinson was probably unaware of was that the head of the Australian War Records Section, Charles Bean, the same one who would go on to form the Australian War Memorial, had apparently stepped in and intervened to ensure the tank went to Brisbane. On its arrival on the 2nd of June 1919, however, it seems to have taken the state government by surprise. A hasty telegram was sent to the Agent General, who confirmed that there was no reason to doubt that it was to remain in Queensland. The tank was unloaded by using a special crane at Norman Wharf along the Brisbane River, though Mephisto would remain there until the middle of August, when authority would arrive from Melbourne stating the tank was to be placed on display at the Queensland Museum. Compared to the operation to recover Mephisto from the shell crater, it seems the same level of preparation and planning was not undertaken to transport the 30-ton machine the roughly 3 kilometers to its new home. 2 council steamrollers would fill in for the gun carriers and would be employed to physically drag it through the streets at an operation that commenced at midnight and took until 11 AM the following day. However, in doing so, the road was churned up by the now seized up caterpillar tracks, and there apparently is buildings to this day along the route that still bear the scars of Mephisto scraping against them. It wasn't until October 1920 that the state government of Queensland received final confirmation that, as a special case, Mephisto would be allowed to remain in Brisbane. Presumably due to the uncertain nature of Mephisto's fate, the tank had been put on display out in the open at the museum's entrance until a roof was built to protect it. Although a highlight for many visitors to the museum, others were less enthusiastic about the deteriorating relic. And by 1946, its popularity had decreased even further to the point where the museum's acting director regarded the tank as merely an ugly object across the entrance to the museum, unquote, and requested its removal. Eventually, there were signs of a change of fortune, however, in 1970, when the tank was moved to a new shelter and the exterior was sandblasted. Regrettably, it removed all remaining traces of the original paint. The artworks and graffiti that the 26th Battalion had applied to it had already been long gone by this point, and the aging hull was now given a new coat of green camouflage paint. In 1986, Mephisto was on the move once again when the museum relocated to the Queensland Cultural Centre, though interestingly no provision had been made to display the tank within the new galleries, so once again it stood outside, sitting underneath a leaky pedestrian walkway until a humidity-controlled display space was built near the Grey Street entrance. Unfortunately, Mephisto was there in 2011 when the Brisbane River flooded and inundated the display space, though fortunately the waters only reached the top of the caterpillar tracks, but once again Mephisto was bogged down in mud. Mephisto would be relocated for conservation and then to a temporary home at the Workshops Rail Museum in Ipswich. It took roughly 100 years for Mephisto to finally get an actual permanent home, and as it was being built, the tank would be relocated, albeit temporarily, to the place it was initially intended to go to, the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, where it was on display on the lower level of the now decommissioned Anzac Hall as part of the commemoration for the centenary of the First World War. This is where I had the privilege of seeing it multiple times. Standing before such a beast in the flesh, it is easy to imagine how terrifying such a machine would have been to the soldier on the front line. After departing the Australian War Memorial, Mephisto returned to Queensland, and roughly 100 years after her capture, Queensland Police's ballistic bomb blast unit forensically inspected the damage she sustained during the war and determined that 2 different explosions damaged the tank's superstructure, both apparently German in origin. What was initially presumed to be the result of Allied artillery or aircraft appears to be a scuttling charge that failed to destroy the vehicle and was conducted just prior to it falling into the hands of the 26th. The primary impact burst through the roof, which caused a secondary explosion within Mephisto's ammunition store, which detonated one of the tank's own 57mm shells, sending a perfect imprint of the shell through the floor of the tank. In November 2018, Mephisto was returned to Queensland and now lives in its permanent home, where it sits in a place of pride in the Anzac Legacy Gallery at the Queensland Museum, where hopefully it will stay out of the elements and out of any more mud. Mephisto has been the last surviving A7V in existence for about 80 years. Most of her siblings were either destroyed in the war or scrapped by the Allies by 1919. Only Schnuck and Nixie II survived beyond that, though both were before the same fate when the Imperial War Museum scrapped the Kiwi-captured Schnuck in 1922, and the United States Army would do the same to Nixie II in 1942. The demon Mephistopheles tempted Faust with the gift of knowledge, power, and wealth in exchange for his soul, which has me wondering if the designers of the A7V would have ever imagined that the last of their creation would now serve as a monument to the shared sacrifice of soldiers on both sides of the Great War, and for that monument to sit half a world away, even if that story has been enshrined within internet folklore. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was written, produced, and audio engineered by me, Ross Manuel, with additional research done by Laurie Favell. I'd really appreciate it, and it would help out the show, if you took some time to share this with a friend, or leave a review on Spotify, or Google Podcasts, or iTunes, or anywhere that you listen to podcasts, as it really helps other people find the show. If you want to know more about today's episode, with photos, show notes, and transcripts, head to www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on IWODMJ on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Don't worry, there's a link in the show notes. If you want to follow me for history-related hijinks and other nerdery, you can follow me on practically everything at Doc Winters. Once again, thanks for listening and catch you next time. Bye!